I'm Dr. Peter Arnett, and I'm going to be talking with you today about intelligence as part of the ENIGMA-U Neuropsychology lecture series. First of all, just a brief bio on me. I am a professor of psychology at Penn State University, past president of the National Academy of Neuropsychology. I've also been on the board of directors of the International Neuropsychological Society. I've additionally taught a graduate course on intellectual assessment for over 25 years. To give you an overview of what I'm going to talk about today, so first of all, I'll provide some definitions of intelligence, talk a little bit about the G-factor theory of intelligence, which has kind of dominated the field over the last 100 years. I'll then talk a little bit about two dimensions of intelligence that have been studied pretty intensively, crystallized and fluid intelligence. I'll then tell you a little bit about how intelligence tests, how intelligence is measured. And then we'll discuss a little bit about how intelligence tests are used, so what situations, what we apply them to, then how intelligence tests have been misused over the years. Then I'll kind of sum things up at the end. But first of all, what is intelligence? So there have been a lot of definitions that have been offered over the years, going back to St. Thomas Aquinas, the power to combine and separate. If you look in the Webster's New Collegiate Dictionary, it's defined according to the ability to learn and understand or to deal with new or trying situations, to reason. Ebbinghaus in 1897 referred to it simply as the power of combination. Terman defined it as the power to think abstractly. Binet, who is really the kind of the founder of the modern intelligence test movement, defined it as comprehension, invention, direction, and censorship. Intelligence lies in these four words. And then Barrett defined it as what you do when you don't know what to do. And then finally, Wechsler, who's the author of our two most prominently used intelligence tests, defined it as what we measure with intelligence tests is the capacity of an individual to understand the world about him and his resourcefulness to cope with its challenges. So just to sum up, broadly, intelligence is the power to reason, think abstractly, and solve novel problems. We want to kind of sum up those definitions. And then also, and not necessarily reflected as clearly in the definitions just provided, is the ability to acquire information over a long period of time. All right, so now I want to turn to the G-factor theory of intelligence. And to understand that, we need to first talk a little bit about factor analysis, okay? Now, factor analysis is a way of reducing a large number of variables to a smaller number of variables that make up theoretical dimensions called factors. So how does factor analysis relate to intelligence? Well, when factor analysis is applied to tests designed to measure intelligence, there's a very interesting thing that happens. All of the tests tend to be highly correlated with one another. And so what does it mean for tests to be highly correlated? It just means that when scores on one test are high, scores on another test are high, and vice versa. So when scores on one test are low, scores on another test are low. So regarding this G factor of intelligence then, so it's called G because G refers to this general factor. And that's just the proportion of variance that's common or general to two or more variables. And in this context, you can think of a variable as a measure of intelligence. Okay, I'm going to give you an example of how this might work. Okay, so look at the Venn diagram that I have here in front of you. So let's say we have three tests that are thought to measure intelligence: IQ test 1, test 2, and test 3. If we put those into a factor analysis, we would find that they share a certain amount of their variance together. So they overlap, they correlate together. You can see this big G in the middle. That stands for the general factor. So that's the proportion of the tests that they share in common. So it's the common or the G factor that all the tests have in common. All right, and so the G or the general factor is that proportion of variance that's common or general to two or more variables, as I showed you. And intelligence is thought to be G. So that thing that these tests have in common is thought to represent intelligence. So we just kind of go back to the definitions that I talked about a few minutes ago. And that thing that these tests all share is thought to relate to the ability to reason, think abstractly, acquire information over time. So that brings me to the next issue that I want to talk a little bit about, and that is intelligence one thing or many things? So the G-factor theory of intelligence suggests that there's some core factor that all the tests have in common. And I think that based on the amount of research that's been done on this over the years, clearly there's some validity to this idea, because when we correlate tests of intelligence together, no matter how we slice it, they all seem to be at least positively correlated. But there are two key dimensions of intelligence that are measured by our tests, at least two. There are more than this, but these are two of the key ones: crystallized intelligence and fluid intelligence. So they are highly correlated with one another. So they still relate to this idea of G, but they also have some unique features. Okay, so again, to come back to a Venn diagram, sort of simply showing you this again. So if we look at crystallized and fluid IQ in the context of G, you can see that they share this G in common in the middle. There's also a lot that they don't share that's unique to each test, all right? So we've got a crystallized test and a fluid test. They do share this variance in common, but also some unique features. And this distinction was first proposed by Ray McTell in 1963, and it's measured by the most commonly used intelligence tests. All right. And so now I want to turn to how intelligence is measured. So what kinds of tests do we use to measure intelligence? Well, there are many measures of intelligence that have been developed, but there really are two that are the most commonly used by far. So there's the WAIS-4, which is the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. It's used with adults, and there's the WISC-5, which is the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children. And those are really by far the most commonly used tests of intelligence. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of the kinds of tests that the subtests that make up these batteries. So really the WAIS and the WISC are batteries of tests. So there are a couple of tests that really kind of define that crystallized dimension very well: a vocabulary test and an information test. So as far as the vocabulary test, the person is just asked to define some words. So they start out fairly simple and they get harder as you go on. And then for the information test, it's just a test of like knowledge questions. So you might have a question: what kind of a tree does an acorn come from? Or something like, what's the capital of France? And so questions are easier at the beginning, they get harder as you go on. And so those are really two very prototypical crystallized tests that come from the WAIS and the WISC. Now, as far as fluid tests, the two tests that I wanted to talk about that I think really illustrate this very well are block design and matrix reasoning. So with block design, the person is shown some pictures in a booklet. Then they are asked to take some blocks and put them together to match the designs. And they start out pretty easy and they get harder, like all these tests. Then with matrix reasoning, the person is shown a picture, a figure in a booklet, and there's a piece missing, and then they're given 5 choices at the bottom of the page. They have to pick the one piece that would best complete the pattern, most logically complete the pattern. So these tests are the kinds of tests that make up these batteries. And again, I wanted to kind of emphasize the crystallized and fluid because those are two really important dimensions of intelligence that we have come to understand. So some properties of crystallized versus fluid intelligence. So again, these are very distinct kinds of dimensions of intelligence. So one of the things we know very clearly at this point is that crystallized intelligence does increase gradually over the lifespan. It kind of makes sense when you think about it too, because the longer you live in the world, the more information you tend to acquire. So your vocabulary may get a little bit better, you may acquire more information about the world around you, and so it gradually increases over the lifespan. And it's not usually affected by most brain injuries. So if a person has a moderate, severe brain injury, a concussion or something like that, typically won't see the crystallized intelligence is affected much at all. And also, crystallized intelligence hasn't changed much in the population over time. So there have been studies that have looked at this over the last, really the last 100 years in the United States and other countries around the world to see whether this has changed much over time, and it really hasn't. And so if you look at people's vocabulary, if you look at the amount of information that people know about the information around them, really hasn't changed much over time. Which I find kind of surprising when you think about it, right? Because we're all getting bombarded with so much more information now than, say, our ancestors 60 years ago, and yet our vocabularies are about the same, and we have about the same knowledge about the world around us. Now, fluid intelligence is different. So first of all, fluid intelligence appears to decline markedly with age. So if we look at, say, the norms for people who are in their late teens and early 20s, their fluid intelligence is very, very high. But if you look at somebody in their 60s or 70s, then it's much lower. So you take a test like block design, you'd need a much lower score if you're in your 60s to get an average score on block design that you would need if you were in your 20s or something like that. And fluid intelligence is usually affected by brain injuries as well. So if somebody has a moderate to severe brain injury, they might be likely to show a decline in something like block design, something like matrix reasoning, relative to where they were before. And also, and this is really striking, fluid intelligence appears to have markedly increased in the population over time. So if you look at the past 100 years, this has happened in countries all over the world. Intelligence scores have increased a lot over time, but it's really mainly due to fluid intelligence increasing and not crystallized intelligence. Next, I want to turn to how IQ tests are used. So first of all, they're very commonly used in educational evaluations. So for things like trying to help people who might have learning disorders or dyslexia, ADHD. And so, you might use an IQ test, or a psychologist might use an IQ test if a student is really struggling in school and you're trying to figure out, well, what's going on here? Is it due to the fact that their intellectual abilities are just not very good, or could be their intellectual abilities are actually quite good, but maybe they have a learning disability in reading, so their IQ scores are pretty good, but their reading scores are very low. Or you could have somebody who may have ADHD, again, somebody whose intellectual function may be quite good, but they have a lot of problems with, say, memory, paying attention, concentrating, and things like that. And so IQ test is a foundation for these kinds of evaluations, where the psychologist might use other tests as well, such as tests of memory, attention, processing speed, things like that. IQ tests are also commonly used in evaluation of patients who've experienced brain injuries like concussions or mild and severe traumatic brain injuries. And these can be really useful, especially those crystallized tests, because again, they tend not to be affected too much at all by things like brain injuries. So they can provide a really good reference point for interpreting how the person should perform in other, like, fluid tests or processing speed tests, tests of attention, things that are much more likely to be affected by things like brain injuries. And also IQ tests are commonly used in evaluation of patients who may have neurological diseases or cognitive problems with aging, like mild cognitive impairment, Alzheimer's disease, other types of dementias. So again, it can provide a really good foundation for trying to understand what's going on with the person. Then finally, IQ tests are commonly used in research. They could be used as a reference point for being able to just see how intellectual function might be affected in different kinds of conditions. In fact, some of those conditions that are often where IQ tests are often used in clinical practice. Now, intelligence tests, unfortunately, have been quite misused in our history, and it's really a black mark in the field of psychology, I must say, when we look back at this and consider. But it's important that we understand this part of our history. And then, so first of all, laws were passed by 21 state legislatures in the United States starting in the early 1900s for involuntary sterilization of those with low IQs. These laws were upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1927. And unfortunately, these laws were also very strongly supported by prominent psychologists of the era, like Thorndike, Terman, Goddard, others. These are other people you may have heard about, read about in your introductory psychology courses if you've had them. But again, not a great endorsement of our psychologists of that era. And it really, these eugenics programs involved tens of thousands of people, and some of the laws stayed in the books until the 1960s. So something to keep in mind. These tests have been misused over the years. We're in a better place now, but it's important, again, that we understand this part of our history. And then also, intelligence tests were misused in the immigration process in the United States. They were used to screen immigrants coming into Ellis Island. Now, many of the immigrants spoke little to no English, yet they were tested with measures designed for English speakers. And these methods were also supported by many prominent American psychologists, like Goddard is another one you may have read about. And so, again, not a great chapter in the history of our psychological work. But at any rate, just to sum up then, not to end on too negative a note, intelligence is a very important construct in psychology and neuroscience. It's probably been studied more than just about any other construct in psychology over the past 100+ years. We understand a lot about it, and we have a lot of knowledge about intelligence, and we can really now very effectively use intelligence tests in clinical practice to help people who might be struggling in school, to help people who have neurological conditions, help people who have had traumatic brain injuries. And we can also use it in research to help us understand some of these disorders. So I thank you for your time today, and best of luck to you.